Did you ever wonder what student life was like before Wi-Fi and even before printing presses? What if your dorm room was a pigsty and your professors had a whip? Get ready to uncover the shocking realities of student life in a medieval university back in the 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Number 7. Constant struggle with poverty and scarcity. Imagine a young student, maybe barely a teenager, arriving in a bustling university town like Oxford or Paris in the 13th century. He probably walked hundreds of miles from his rural village, his meager possessions wrapped in a cloth. His family likely scraped together every last penny to send him, hoping he would rise above their station, perhaps become a priest, a lawyer, or a doctor. But the reality that greeted him was often a brutal test of survival, a daily fight against the gnawing emptiness of hunger and the bitter chill of poverty. Many students, perhaps even the majority, lived on the absolute edge of destitution, a constant struggle for the basic necessities of life. Cost of an education in the medieval period, while not involving tuition fees in the modern sense at many institutions, was immense for anyone without inherited wealth. Books were handwritten and incredibly expensive, often costing more than a small house. Lodging, even the most basic kind, required money. Food, especially enough to sustain a growing mind and body, was a perpetual drain on resources. Many students relied on small stipends from wealthy patrons or from their home parishes, but these funds were often irregular, meager, or simply ran out. Records from various universities, including Bologna and Salerno, show countless instances of students arriving with great aspirations, but quickly finding themselves in dire straits. Common sight in medieval university towns was the poor scholar, a figure recognizable by his threadbare clothes, often patched and mended countless times. These students would often resort to begging for food, standing at church doors or in market squares, appealing to the charity of passers-by. Chronicles from the time describe groups of scholars singing hymns for alms, their voices hoarse with hunger, their faces pale. It was not uncommon for university statutes to mention begging, sometimes even regulating it, not to forbid it, but to ensure it was done in an orderly fashion, a testament to how widespread the practice was. Some universities even had specific funds set aside for the relief of the poorest students, but these were rarely enough to meet the overwhelming demand. Lodging for these impoverished scholars was far from comfortable. They often shared tiny, unheated rooms, sometimes with half a dozen or more other students sleeping on straw mattresses laid directly on the floor. Privacy was a luxury few could afford. The cold in winter was severe, and many students suffered from chronic coughs, fevers, and chilblains. Fires were expensive, and often students had to rely on shared warmth and huddle together for protection against the biting winds that swept through their drafty quarters. The lack of proper light meant studying often stopped when the sun went down, unless a student could afford the exorbitant cost of candles or oil lamps. Many historical accounts detail how students would wrap themselves in their cloaks or what little bedding they had, trying to ward off the cold while poring over their precious hand-copied notes. Food was another relentless concern. Typical diet for a poor scholar consisted primarily of coarse bread, perhaps some weak beer or ale, safer than water, and occasionally a small piece of cheese or dried fish. Meat was a rare luxury, reserved for feast days, or for those with more means. Many students faced days, sometimes even weeks, of extreme hunger, their stomachs growling during long lectures. This constant deprivation affected their concentration and their physical health. Malnutrition was a widespread issue, making students more susceptible to illness and less able to fight off the numerous diseases that plagued medieval cities. A 14th century account from a student at the University of Paris lamented having nothing but a crust of bread for his meals, a stark contrast to the rich feasts imagined by those who thought of university life as a grand endeavor. For some, the The struggle for survival became so desperate that it drove them to illicit means. Theft, while severely punished, was not unheard of among the truly impoverished scholars. A student might steal food from a market stall or even a book from a wealthier colleague hoping to pawn it for a meal. The university records, while primarily detailing academic matters, sometimes contain grim references to students apprehended for petty crimes, their desperation often cited as a mitigating factor, though rarely saving them from harsh punishment. This pressure often led to students dropping out, unable to continue their studies due to sheer economic hardship. They would return home often poorer and more disillusioned than when they left, their dreams of a better life shattered by the realities of medieval poverty. The system of servitors or battlers arose as a way for some poor students to survive. These students would serve wealthier students, professors, or college fellows, performing menial tasks like cleaning rooms, carrying water, running errands, or even acting as personal assistants. In exchange, they received free lodging and meals, and sometimes a small stipend. While this allowed them to continue their studies, it came at a significant cost to their dignity and their time. A servitor might spend hours each day fetching and carrying, leaving little time or energy for their own demanding academic work. This created a stark social hierarchy within the university, with the servitors occupying the lowest rung, constantly reminded of their subordinate status. Chronicles from Oxford indicate that servitors were often treated with disdain by their more privileged peers, further compounding their hardships. The very concept of a scholarship, in the medieval sense, was also deeply intertwined with charity. Many scholarships were funded by pious donations, often specifying that the recipients should be poor and deserving. These benefactors would establish foundations to support a certain number of students, providing them with basic room and board. However, even these scholarships were often insufficient to cover all expenses, and students still found themselves needing to economize in every possible way. The documents outlining these endowments often describe the ideal scholar as humble, devout, and dedicated to study, reflecting the hope that these charitable acts would produce virtuous and learned individuals who would contribute positively to society. Yet, for all the good intentions, the reality for most students was a grinding daily grind of hunger, cold, and a constant desperate struggle to make ends meet, a world away from the comfortable university experiences we often envision. Number 6. Brutal discipline and violent hazing. Picture a young student, no older than 14, standing before a stern master, his hands outstretched, waiting for the crack of a rod against his palms. Or perhaps he's a new arrival, abeyance or yellow beak, surrounded by a group of older students with menacing grins, about to endure a night of humiliation and physical torment. Student life in a medieval university was not just academically rigorous. It was also defined by a culture of harsh discipline, both from authority figures and from fellow students, creating an environment that could be terrifying and deeply abusive. Physical punishment was not only accepted, but considered a necessary and effective tool for shaping young minds and maintaining order. Masters, the professors of their day, held immense authority over their students, an authority that often extended to physical chastisement. For minor infractions, such as failing to attend the lecture, speaking out of turn, or simply not performing well enough, a student could expect to be flogged. This wasn't a gentle tap on the wrist. It was a public and often brutal beating with a rod or a birch switch. Records from institutions like the University of Heidelberg in the 14th century detail statutes outlining the specific punishments for various offenses, and physical beatings are a recurring theme. The idea was that painful correction would instill discipline and drive out youthful folly. Students were expected to accept these punishments without complaint, as defiance would only lead to further, more severe beatings. The master was seen as a surrogate parent, and just as a parent might physically correct a child, so too would a master correct his student. Beyond the formal discipline of the masters, new students faced an even more insidious form of brutality: hazing. When a young boy arrived at the university, often far from home and utterly alone, he became a Bajunus in Paris, a freshman in Oxford, or a Cornutus, horned one, in other places, signifying his unrefined, beastly nature that needed to be shed. Older students themselves, perhaps having gone through similar ordeals, would subject the newcomers to elaborate and often cruel initiation rituals. These hazing practices, known as depositio corneum, shedding of horns, in some parts of Europe, were supposedly symbolic, meant to cleanse the newcomer of their ignorance and rural manners. But in practice, they were often nothing short of systematic torture and humiliation. Accounts from the 14th and 15th centuries vividly describe these hazing rites. New students might be forced to wear ridiculous outfits, have their faces smeared with grime or animal dung, or be paraded through the streets to the amusement of onlookers. They were often subjected to mock trials, where older students would act as judges and prosecutors, accusing the Behonis of various fabricated crimes, from ignorance to arrogance. The punishments handed down were often painful: forced to drink foul concoctions, beaten with sticks, or made to perform degrading tasks. Some initiates were forced to pay exorbitant fees, a form of extortion, or provide lavish feasts for their tormentors. Failure to comply could result in even harsher beatings or social ostracism, making the new student's life even more miserable. One particularly infamous form of hazing involved students being tied up, blindfolded, and then subjected to various torments, including being doused with cold water, tickled with feathers, or having their hair pulled. The psychological impact of such rituals, designed to break down a new student's spirit and make them subservient, was profound. Young boys, barely out of childhood, suddenly found themselves in a hostile environment, with no one to turn to for protection. Culture of silence surrounding these practices meant that few dared to complain, fearing further retribution from their tormentors. University authorities sometimes issued decrees against excessive hazing, acknowledging its brutal nature. But these rules were often ignored, and the traditions persisted for centuries. The violence was not just confined to formal discipline or hazing. Student life itself was often violent. Disputes among students, whether over academic arguments, gambling debts, or romantic rivalries, frequently escalated into brawls. Many students, especially those from noble or wealthier backgrounds, carried knives or daggers in fights, could quickly turn deadly. Duels, though officially forbidden, were not unheard of. The absence of a strong, centralized police force meant that students often took justice into their own hands. University statutes from Oxford and Cambridge frequently mention prohibitions against carrying weapons within university precincts, and records detail instances of students being punished for assault and even murder. Constant threat of physical violence, whether from a master's rod, an older student's cruel prank, or a rival's blade, shaped the daily experience of medieval scholars. It instilled a sense of fear and caution, but also fostered a certain toughness and resilience. Students learned to navigate a harsh social landscape where status and respect were often asserted through dominance. The emphasis on discipline was not just about intellectual rigor. It was about molding individuals to fit into a rigid social structure, using pain and fear as potent instruments of control. For a modern student, the idea of daily life being punctuated by the fear of a beating or a brutal initiation ceremony is truly a shocking reality, highlighting the vastly different cultural norms around authority and education in the medieval period. Number 5. Pervasive filth, disease, and the shadow of death. Step into the shoes of a medieval university student, and immediately you would be overwhelmed by the stench. The air, far from fresh, would be thick with the smell of unwashed bodies, human waste, rotting food, and general decay. Cleanliness, as we understand it today, simply did not exist. This pervasive filth, coupled with rudimentary medical knowledge, meant that disease was a constant lurking threat, and death was an all too familiar companion in the hallowed halls of learning. The sheer reality of living in such unsanitary conditions, constantly surrounded by sickness, was a shocking truth of medieval student life. Student lodgings, whether in rented rooms, private halls, or early colleges, were typically cramped, poorly ventilated, and rarely cleaned. Waste disposal was primitive. Human and animal waste was often simply thrown into the streets or collected in open cesspits, attracting hordes of rats and other vermin. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were an inescapable part of daily life, causing constant itching and discomfort. Personal hygiene was minimal. Bathing was infrequent, perhaps a few times a year for some, and often done in cold water. Clothes were rarely washed, and many students owned only one or two outfits, which they wore until they literally fell apart. Communal nature of living meant that diseases spread rapidly through shared bedding, shared eating utensils, and close proximity. Accounts from the University of Bologna describe students sharing beds and even the same worn cloaks for warmth, inadvertently creating perfect breeding grounds for pathogens. The direct consequence of this abysmal sanitation was the omnipresence of disease. Epidemics were a regular occurrence, sweeping through university towns with terrifying speed and lethality. Dysentery, a highly contagious diarrheal disease, was common, fueled by contaminated water sources and unsanitary food preparation. Typhus, spread by lice and fleas, was another frequent killer, often striking during cold months when people huddled together. Smallpox, measles, and influenza were also ever-present threats, especially to young people whose immune systems might be weakened by poor nutrition and constant stress. Chroniclers of the time frequently note outbreaks that would decimate student populations, forcing universities to suspend lectures or even temporarily close their doors. The Black Death, arriving in Europe in the mid-14th century, brought this reality into horrifying focus. While universities sometimes tried to flee the plague-ridden cities, the disease often followed them, or students carried it back from their homes. During the peak years of the plague, some universities saw their student numbers plummet by half or more. The sheer scale of death was unimaginable. Students would witness their friends, roommates, and even their masters succumbing to the disease within days, their bodies quickly disposed of in mass graves. The fear of contagion, the constant presence of death carts in the streets, and the sight of loved ones suffering must have cast a dark shadow over academic pursuits. Medical knowledge in the medieval period was rudimentary at best. Physicians often relied on ancient Greek texts, astrology, and practices like bloodletting or purging, which often did more harm than good. The understanding of disease transmission was almost non-existent. The concept of germs was centuries away. When a student fell ill, treatment options were limited, often involving herbal remedies, prayers, or simply waiting to see if the patient recovered or succumbed. Hospitals, where they existed, were often more like hospices, providing basic care but little in the way of effective treatment. Most students relied on informal care from their peers, or a kind master, or simply suffered alone. Constant proximity to death fostered a particular worldview among medieval students. Life was seen as fragile and fleeting, a preparatory stage for the afterlife. This belief could lead to both extreme piety and reckless revelry. Some students might become more devout, seeking solace in religion and preparing their souls for an uncertain future. Others might embrace a more fatalistic outlook, indulging in drinking, gambling, and other vices, believing that life was short and should be enjoyed while it lasted. The memento mori, a reminder of mortality, was not an abstract concept, but a daily reality. The bells of the local church constantly tolled for the dead, a stark soundtrack to their studies. The loss of friends and fellow scholars was a common and painful experience. A student might arrive at the university with a group from his hometown, only to see them dwindle over the years due to illness. This constant turnover meant that student communities, while vibrant, were also characterized by a transient nature, with new faces arriving and old ones disappearing with alarming regularity. The emotional toll of this cycle of sickness and death must have been immense, shaping their worldview and their understanding of their place in the world. For a modern student, accustomed to relatively clean environments and advanced medical care, the unfiltered reality of medieval filth, rampant disease, and the pervasive shadow of death is a truly unsettling glimpse into a bygone era. Number 4. Rigid curriculum and rote memorization in Latin. Forget about choosing your own courses, engaging in lively debates about modern theories, or even doing independent research. Student life in a medieval university, particularly in the foundational arts faculty, was a world defined by a remarkably rigid curriculum, an almost obsessive emphasis on rote memorization, and the unwavering dominance of a single ancient language, Latin. This structured, often repetitive approach to learning is a shocking contrast to today's diverse and flexible educational landscape. The first hurdle for any aspiring scholar was Latin. It was not just a subject. It was the entire medium of instruction. Lectures, textbooks, which were painstakingly copied by hand, academic discussions, and even everyday conversations within the university were conducted exclusively in Latin. For a student from a rural village, whose native tongue might have been an early form of French, German, or English, mastering Latin was an enormous undertaking. Many new students struggle profoundly in their first few years, unable to fully grasp the lectures or participate in academic discussions because of the language barrier. University statutes often mandated that students speak Latin among themselves, even outside formal settings, to accelerate their proficiency. A 14th century student manual from Oxford advises newcomers to always speak Latin, even when you go to the latrine, emphasizing the total immersion required. The curriculum of the arts faculty, which all students had to complete before moving on to higher faculties like law, medicine, or theology, was based on the 7 liberal arts, divided into the trivium, grammar, rhetoric, dialectic, geometry, astronomy, music. While this sounds broad, the approach to these subjects was far from what we would recognize today. Grammar meant exhaustive study of Latin texts and the rules of the language. Rhetoric focused on the art of eloquent speech and writing, but it was dialectic, or logic, that dominated the curriculum, particularly the works of Aristotle. Students spent years dissecting Aristotle's treatises on logic, learning how to construct arguments, identify fallacies, and engage in formal disputations. Primary method of teaching was the lectio, or lecture. The master would read aloud from a prescribed text, often an ancient authority like Aristotle, Plato, though less common directly, Euclid, or the Bible. Students, hunched over rough parchment, would painstakingly copy down the words, often verbatim, to create their own textbooks. There were no printing presses, so books were incredibly expensive and rare. A single copy of a major work might cost more than a manor house. Therefore, note-taking was crucial. Students learned to write quickly, developing abbreviations and shorthand to keep up with the master's pace. This was not a passive listening exercise. It was an act of creation, building their own library of knowledge, one painstakingly copied word at a time. Rote memorization was king. Students were expected to commit vast quantities of text to memory, not just passages, but entire works. They had to be able to recall intricate logical arguments, lists of grammatical rules and mathematical principles with flawless accuracy. Examinations were primarily oral, involving extensive questioning and formal disputations, where students had to defend a thesis against objections from their masters and peers, all in Latin, and often requiring them to cite specific texts or passages from memory. The emphasis was not on original thought or critical analysis in the modern sense, but on the accurate understanding, retention, and application of established knowledge and authoritative texts. Deviation from accepted interpretations was often discouraged, particularly in the higher faculties, as it could be seen as heresy or a challenge to established dogma. The disputatio was the intellectual centerpiece of medieval university life. These were formal debates where students, and later masters, would argue a specific question or thesis. One student would propose a question, another would argue against it, and a third would attempt to resolve the arguments. These were highly structured events, governed by strict rules of logic and rhetoric, all conducted in Latin. While they offered a form of intellectual engagement, their purpose was not to discover new truths, but to refine understanding of existing ones, and to demonstrate mastery of the scholastic method. The goal was to reach a conclusion consistent with the established authorities, particularly Aristotle and theological dogma, not to challenge them. The sheer duration of study was also shocking. The arts course alone could take 5 to 7 years, followed by another 5 to 10 years for a higher degree in law, medicine, or theology. This meant that many students spent their entire youth, sometimes 2 decades, within the university system, constantly immersed in this rigorous Latin-dominated and memory-intensive intellectual world. The intellectual output, while formidable in its own way, was often characterized by detailed analysis of existing texts, creating commentaries upon commentaries, rather than grounding original research as we understand it today. This rigid adherence to established texts and methods, coupled with the linguistic barrier, created an educational experience that would be almost unrecognizable and perhaps overwhelming to a modern student. Number 3, unspeakable: youth and profound loneliness. Picture a boy, perhaps no older than 12 or 13, standing at the edge of a bustling, unfamiliar city. He has likely just completed a long, arduous journey, perhaps on foot, from his distant village. He is far from his family, his friends, and everything familiar. This is the reality for countless young scholars entering medieval universities. They were not young adults, they were children thrust into a harsh, often unforgiving environment, experiencing a profound sense of loneliness and vulnerability that would be shocking to a modern mind accustomed to extended childhoods and supportive networks. The age of entry into a medieval university was startlingly young by today's standards. While some students might have been older, many began their studies in the arts faculty between the ages of 12 and 15. Some chroniclers even mentioned students as young as 10 or 11. These were boys, still developing, still reliant on the care and guidance of their families. Yet, they were expected to live independently, manage their meager resources, and cope with the immense academic and social pressures of university life. This early departure from home was a monumental step, often signifying a complete and permanent break from their past lives. Many would not see their families again for years, if ever, given the difficulties and dangers of travel. The journey itself to a university town was often fraught with peril. Students from distant regions might have to walk for weeks or even months, facing dangers from bandits, wild animals, and the elements. They relied on the kindness of strangers or the occasional monastery for shelter. Arriving in a large, noisy city like Paris or Bologna, with its crowded streets, unfamiliar customs, and foreign dialects, must have been an overwhelming and frightening experience for a young, unworldly boy. The university itself, with its complex hierarchies, demanding masters, and often brutal older students, offered little in the way of immediate comfort or reassurance. Once enrolled, the sense of isolation could be profound. Students lived in communal settings, but these were rarely nurturing environments. Older students often took advantage of the younger ones, exploiting them for chores or subjecting them to the infamous hazing rituals. Masters, while having authority, were primarily concerned with academic instruction and discipline, not emotional support. There were no counselors, no designated support staff to help these young boys navigate their new lives. The lack of familiar faces, the absence of familial affection, and the constant struggle for survival created an emotional vacuum that many students struggled to fill. Letters from students of the period, though rare survivors, sometimes reveal glimpses of this deep loneliness. They write to their parents or patrons requesting more funds, but also expressing longing for home, for news of their families, or simply for a familiar presence. One 15th-century letter from a student at the University of Leipzig to his mother, preserved in an archive, mentions his persistent cough and longing for her cooking, a simple plea that dosed the emotional deprivation. The rigors of academic life, combined with inadequate food and constant cold, further compounded their vulnerability, making them susceptible not just to physical illness, but also to profound despair. The colleges and halls, which eventually became the dominant form of student lodging, were designed to provide some structure and supervision, ostensibly protecting students from the dangers of the town. However, even within these institutions, life could be harsh. Rules were strict, punishments severe, and the communal nature meant little personal space or privacy. For a young boy still adapting to the demands of Latin and logic, the added pressure of living in close quarters with dozens of other young men, many of whom were older and more experienced in the ways of the world, could be incredibly daunting. They had to learn to fend for themselves very quickly, to navigate complex social dynamics, and to survive in an environment where comfort and emotional support were scarce commodities. The rapid maturation forced upon these young scholars was a defining characteristic of medieval student life. They had to learn resilience, self-reliance, and a certain hardened stoicism to endure the challenges. Many undoubtedly suffered in silence, their struggles unseen and unacknowledged by the larger university system. The image of a medieval student is often one of a dedicated scholar poring over ancient texts. But beneath that image lies the stark reality of a child, far from home, often hungry and cold, grappling with profound loneliness in a world that offered little in the way of comfort or compassion, a truly shocking and often overlooked aspect of their daily existence. Number 2. Constant, violent conflicts, town vs. gown. Imagine waking up to the sound of angry shouting and the clang of metal on cobblestones, knowing that another riot between students and townsfolk has erupted and you might be caught in the middle. The relationship between medieval universities filled with their privileged scholars and the local towns where they were situated was a perpetual powder keg, often erupting into violent and deadly clashes. These town and gown riots were a shocking and recurrent feature of student life, a constant tension that could escalate from a petty squabble to a full-blown battle, sometimes with fatal consequences. The root of this animosity lay in a complex mix of economic, social, and legal factors. Students, along with university masters, enjoyed significant privileges and exemptions granted by kings and popes. They were often exempt from local taxes, could sometimes set their own prices for lodging and goods, and crucially were usually subject to university courts, not the town's legal system. This meant a student who committed a crime might be judged by a master or a university official, often receiving lighter sentences than a townsman for the same offense. This created immense resentment among the local population, who felt the scholars were arrogant, unruly, and beyond the reach of justice. From the town's perspective, students were a rowdy, sometimes destructive, and often financially exploitative presence. They frequently drank heavily, gambled, visited prostitutes, and engaged in boisterous behavior. They were accused of inflating prices for food and lodging due to their demand, and their academic pursuits often seemed abstract and irrelevant to the daily lives of tradesmen and laborers. The local artisans, innkeepers, and merchants saw students as both a source of income and a constant nuisance, a group of young, privileged men who often acted with impunity. The inevitable clashes could be triggered by the smallest incident: a drunken argument in a tavern, a dispute over a bill, a flirtatious glance at a townsman's wife, or simply an exchange of insults. But these minor provocations would quickly escalate. Students often carried weapons, such as knives or daggers, and townsfolk were also armed with their tools, sticks, or whatever they could grab. What began as a fistfight could quickly turn into a street brawl, involving dozens, sometimes hundreds, on both sides. The famous St. Scholastica Day riot in Oxford in 1355 is a brutal example. It started with a dispute between students and a tavern keeper over the quality of wine. Within hours, the entire town was in an uproar. Townsmen, supported by local gentry, attacked students, burning their halls, killing many, and desecrating their bodies. In retaliation, the Bishop of Lincoln later excommunicated many townsmen, and the town of Oxford was forced for centuries to pay a yearly penance to the university, underscoring the university's ultimate authority. These riots were not isolated incidents, but a regular feature of life in university towns across Europe. In Paris, conflicts between students and the city watch or citizens were so frequent that royal charters were issued repeatedly to try and curb the violence. The University of Bologna, famous for its law school, also saw its fair share of violent confrontations, often fueled by regional rivalries among student nations. The nations were student organizations based on their geographic origin, and they often engaged in fierce rivalries, sometimes turning their animosity towards the townspeople or other nations. The university authorities, often backed by the monarch or the pope, generally sided with the students, seeing them as essential to the intellectual life of the kingdom. Kings understood that a thriving university attracted talent and prestige. Therefore, when major riots occurred, the response from higher authorities was usually to punish the town, imposing heavy fines, stripping them of privileges, or even forcing them to make humiliating public apologies to the university. This further entrenched the sense of injustice among the townsfolk and ensured that the underlying tensions never truly dissipated. For students, living with this constant threat meant a certain vigilance. Going to a tavern, or simply walking through certain parts of town, could be dangerous. They formed their own informal gangs or alliances for protection, often based on their nation or college. The sense of belonging to the gown was strong, forged in shared academic pursuits, but also in shared antagonism with the town. This created a unique identity, a group set apart, both intellectually and socially, from the common folk. The constant friction and the potential for violence added a palpable sense of danger and excitement to student life, a shocking contrast to the relatively peaceful coexistence between universities and their host cities today. It was a stark reminder that in the medieval world, intellectual pursuits did not exempt one from the raw, often brutal realities of social conflict. Number 1. Vice and revelry, the unholy side of student life. Forget the image of perpetually pious scholars huddled over dusty texts, living lives of monastic asceticism. The shocking truth of medieval student life, often overlooked, is that university towns were hotbeds of vice and unrestrained revelry. Despite the strong religious foundations of these institutions, students were notorious for their hard drinking, gambling, brawling, and frequenting of prostitutes. This unholy side of academic life reveals a complex and often contradictory picture of youthful exuberance and moral laxity, far removed from the sober scholarly ideal. Alcohol was an undeniable, pervasive presence in medieval student life. Beer and ale were consumed in vast quantities. Water sources were often contaminated, making beer a safer and more appealing alternative for hydration. Taverns, not just libraries or lecture halls, were central to the student experience. They were places for socializing, for informal debates, for meeting friends, and for escaping the rigors of academic life. Accounts from university towns like Paris, Oxford, and Bologna frequently mention the proliferation of taverns catering specifically to students. Many students spent a significant portion of their meager income on drink, often leading to debt and further desperation. Chroniclers from the 13th and 14th centuries lament the widespread drunkenness among scholars, noting how often it led to fights, public disturbances, and neglect of studies. The wandering scholars or goliards of the period, a subculture of students who often abandoned formal study for a life of wandering and revelry, left behind satirical poems and songs that celebrated drinking, gambling, and a carefree, often hedonistic lifestyle. Gambling was another rampant vice. Dice games, card games, after cards were introduced to Europe, and other forms of wagering were immensely popular. Students would gamble away their allowances, their precious books, and even their clothes. This often led to significant debt, which could spiral into further illicit activities or force students to abandon their studies. University statutes from the University of Cologne in the 14th century, for example, strictly forbid gambling within university premises and dormitories, highlighting how common and problematic it was. Despite these prohibitions, gambling dens flourished in and around university towns, drawing in students eager to try their luck, often with disastrous consequences for their finances and their academic careers. Prostitution was also a thriving industry around medieval university communities. Despite the university's ties to the church and the moral teachings of the time, the large concentrations of young, unattached men far from home created a ready market for sexual services. Brothels and individual prostitutes operated openly or semi-openly in many university towns. University records, while not explicit, sometimes contain disciplinary actions against students for immoral conduct or frequenting disreputable places, thinly veiled references to their interactions with prostitutes. For instance, the statutes of Merton College, Oxford, contain provisions against students bringing women into their rooms, a rule that suggests the practice was a known issue. This starkly contrasts with the idealized image of chaste scholars dedicating themselves solely to the pursuit of knowledge. Combination of alcohol, gambling, and youthful exuberance often led to frequent brawls. Students, armed with knives or simply their fists, would engage in fights with each other, with townsfolk, or with rival student groups. These fights could be over gambling debts, women, academic disputes, or simply drunken insults. The streets of university towns were often unsafe, especially at night. University authorities constantly struggled to control this rowdy behavior, issuing decrees against public disturbances, carrying weapons, and even against students singing or shouting loudly in the streets after dark. However, these rules were often ignored, and the culture of physical violence and unrestrained revelry persisted. Carmina Burana, a collection of medieval Latin poems and songs, many attributed to Goliards, provides a fascinating if sometimes exaggerated glimpse into this side of student life. These songs celebrate the pleasures of the tavern, the joys of love, the thrill of gambling, and often mock the rigid piety of the church or the solemnity of academic life. They capture the spirit of young men living far from home, free from direct parental supervision, embracing a more bohemian and often morally ambiguous existence. This counter-cultural current within the university system highlights the tension between the official pious ideals of the institutions and the lived reality of its youthful, often rebellious inhabitants. Presence of widespread vice and revelry in medieval universities is a truly shocking reality, challenging many preconceived notions about the period. It echoes the fact that young people, regardless of the century, have always sought pleasure, companionship, and an escape from their daily pressures. For medieval students, this meant a world where scholarly pursuits coexisted, often uneasily, with heavy drinking, illicit gambling, and sexual escapades, making their daily lives a fascinating and sometimes scandalous blend of learning and licentiousness.